Okay, this morning, the platform is how ethical culture saved American society with ethical culture leader Joe Chuman. Joe is a leader of the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County. He has been there since 1994. Before that, he was leader of the Ethical Culture Society in Essex, a leader in training at the Bergen and New York Society. He served on the leadership committee of the AEU over 20 years and was president of the National Leaders Councils for 6 years. Joe is a representative from the AEU to the International Humanist Ethical Union and was co-mentor of the 6th class of the Humanist Institute. Joe has a PhD in religion from Columbia University, and he teaches seminars in human rights and human rights and religion to graduate students at Columbia University, and advises them in the development of their dissertation and helps them advance studies through their internships and in the international communities. He also teaches human rights to undergraduates at Honors and Hunter College. Joe is a founder and president of the Bergen County Sanctuary for Political Asylum Seekers, and he's published a collection of essays in a book entitled Speaking of Ethics, Living a Humanist Life. My goodness. Yes, and he's also a leader here. So, Joe?
Thank you for that introduction. Most of that, by the way, is ancient history, so right. But thank you very, very much. It's a pleasure to be back here again. It's the beginning of a new season. I hope all of you had restorative summers. What I'd like to do, let me extend a hearty welcome to you all, to veteran members and to those newcomers especially who are here. I hope you get to know us, get to like us, come back again, and really taste the vitality of this really program-rich community. There is so much that goes on here. It's just simply mind-boggling and very embracing, and very sustaining, I think, of values that are very necessary for really the vitality of American society. My talk this morning, and for my first talk of the season, what I'd like to do is talk about ethical culture per se. And this morning my talk is really going to be historical, but I should mention its purpose is not merely an academic review of ethical culture's history. My purpose, moreover, is really to inspire us in the current moment. My reading of politics is that we are at a very dangerous political moment. Demagoguery, authoritarianism, even neo-fascism has risen to the highest levels of American society. As you all know, I think we're a very fractured, divided society, a lot of malaise and discontent and despair. And I think that our democracy is really in jeopardy. There are really dangers afoot. And what I want to do this morning, my title sounds hyperbolic, but it's not hyperbole. What I want to do is look at a particular era in which ethical culture flourished and of which it was a part, that actually confronted political and economic and social problems very similar to the ones we confront today. And the visionaries and progressives and activists of that period actually prevailed to restore America's best values to itself. So my purpose this morning, as I hope I will make clear, is an inspirational one. It's basically to see our past as a usable past. Usable in terms of inspiring us in this moment to not lose faith in our own capacities, and the fact that through requisite effort and devotion and commitment and with the right values, that indeed there is sunshine and light behind the dark skies and clouds that we confront in this current political era. It was 150 years ago, this past May 15th, that ethical culture was founded. It was then that Felix Adler, a 25-year-old idealistic visionary, gave the first in a series of 6 public lectures in which he outlined a new religio-philosophical movement, placing ethical ideals at its center and making a robust commitment to social justice as a requirement for what the religious life must entail. Ethical culture allied itself with the modern world, the world of science, the world of progress, and with a hopeful perspective which drew its inspiration not from what was or had been, but from the promise of what could be. Ethical culture enjoins us not to recapitulate the past, but to build a better future and a better world. On the intellectual side, ethical culture was a rebellion against superstition, ignorance, and irrationalism, and supernatural religion. Religion which was heavy on dogma and doctrine and ritualized practice, but devoid of evidence on which to ground its pronouncements about the human and natural worlds. At the same time, ethical culture rebelled against a scientific determinism that reduced the human being to nothing but molecules in motion, to objects to be abused, violated, and discarded when they no longer prove useful. In claiming that human beings could indeed be inspired by ethical ideals and reach for higher ground, Felix Adler found a way to save and preserve that dimension of human life and experience that vouchsafes our dignity. Ethical culture declares that our humanity is a precious thing, not to be abused, but to be nurtured, respected, indeed to be revered. On the social side, ethical culture was a rebellion against the evils and oppressions wrought by the Industrial Revolution. It was a rebellion against those forces that kept the poor in disease-ridden, overcrowded tenements and stunted the lives of children in dangerous and dehumanizing factories. It was a rebellion against the exploitation and undereducation of the young, the marginalization and poverty of immigrants, the corruption of municipal governments, the excesses of greedy robber barons, the bigotry and deprivations visited on minorities, and the oppressive designs of America about to become an imperialistic power. It was out of the matrix of these injustices and inequalities that ethical culture in its infancy looked beyond itself to carry the banner of social reform, or as Felix Adler liked to refer to it, social reconstruction. If we are to revere the dignity of all human beings, he reasoned, then we must work to transform society to create the conditions in which that dignity will no longer be oppressed, but be brought into the sunlight, so that even the most unfortunate among us will be able to think well of themselves and to flourish in their humanity. And so the most tangible aspects of ethical culture's 140-year history is its history of progressive social change. We can be legitimately proud that our organization, which has never been large, has made such a disproportionate contribution to the betterment of society. Much of it has been path-breaking. Ethical culture has pursued social justice and social service most dramatically through creating venerable institutions, many of which carry on their humanitarian and social justice work to this very day. The list of these creations is very long, and I would like to cite just a few of our accomplishments in our early decades, especially for those who might be new to our community. In 1876, right after we were founded, we created the first free kindergarten in the United States. It was a school for 8 little children, 6 boys and 2 girls, which was from the working class, from the poor working class, that was subsidized totally by the Ethical Culture Society. That then grew into the working man's school and grew even larger to become what it is today, the Ethical Culture Schools, which I dare say has lost its working class character, but indeed, to say the least, but indeed still preserves a commitment to ethics by having a very generous scholarship program for those who are in need and still mandating ethics classes in each one of its grades. In 1876, Felix Adler hired 4 nurses to make rounds in the tenements of the Lower East Side in order to dispense nursing care free of charge and without a proselytizing or missionizing religious message. Well, those 4 nurses morphed into the visiting nurse service. Lillian Wald, who was a social worker and a member of this community, helped incorporate the visiting nurse service into the municipal government of New York City, and today the visiting nurse service, still extant and flourishing, is an international organization, started again by us with just 4 nurses in 1876. In 1888, we started the Child Study Association that tried to bring modern, quote, scientific information. Today, a lot of it would seem very outdated, to the raising of children, okay, a modern effort at child rearing. In that same year, in 1888, our branch in Chicago founded the precursor organization that became the Legal Aid Society, okay? If you need a lawyer and you don't have money, the Legal Aid Society is still there to provide legal counsel for you. In 1889, something that is lost to our history, the New York Society founded something not politically correct these days called the Guild for Crippled Children, okay? That created, I don't know, anybody here live in Westchester? Okay. There's a hospital near Tarrytown called the Blythedale Hospital, whose mandate is still primarily to provide medical care for disabled children. The Blythedale Hospital was our project. It was the Guild for Crippled Children that today is a very significant institution, still indeed loyal to that service. On the intellectual side, the largest philosophical journal in the English language, it's called Ethics, and has long been published by the University of Chicago, was started by Dr. Felix Adler in 1890. Again, sort of quiet contribution, but a lasting one. In 1886, we founded the first settlement house movement in the United States, the University Settlement, and I'll talk a little bit more about the settlement house movement as I move along. But we started 3 settlement houses in New York City in the late 19th century, which are still extant in New York. Madison House University Settlement, which was the first, it's about almost 130 years old, and then the largest one is Hudson Guild on West 26th Street. But we started the settlement house movement. I want to talk more about that because it was not just us, it was actually a large national movement. Okay. In 1909, we helped to found, not alone by any means, helped to found, I'll talk a little bit more about this too, the NAACP, okay? W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the major luminary of that organization, was a friend of our society and spoke from the platform a good number of times here early in the 20th century. Also very interesting, and it was Phyllis Harrison Ross who brought this forefront to my attention. In 1911, Dr. Adler put together what was the first international Congress on race relations, the first ever. It was a global conference held in London, at the University of London, over 5 days, and brought together literally hundreds of presenters from the 5 continents, from what we would call today the developing world, what today we would refer to as indigenous people, to meet face to face for talks, lectures, interaction, and mutual education. I mean, this was really, and this was at the height of European imperialism, okay, in terms of this. And the conference actually created resolutions and so forth that spoke out and condemned European imperialism. And one little footnote to that Congress, even though it took place decades before the emergence of apartheid in South Africa, the origins of the African National Congress, which was Nelson Mandela's party that was the mainstay of putting an end to apartheid so very recently, and in fact emerged out of that Congress in 1911. Very, very interesting event. It was the first Congress of international, people from all continents, Africa, Asia, Native Americans came over and interacted with each other. Interesting visionary sort of event. In 1917, the New York Society helped to found the American Civil Liberties Union. Its founder, Roger Baldwin, who had previously worked with our group in St. Louis in some of their projects, came to New York and founded the ACLU and later became a member of this society. Let me tell you an anecdote. I know we don't have all day, but I can't resist. I actually met Roger Baldwin once. I was in my early 20s. He was in his 90s. And he used to live in Bergen County, New Jersey, where I live and do most of my work. And the ACLU of New Jersey used to put together these very nice annual dinners. And Roger would come to them and sit on the dais. They would honor luminaries in the civil liberties field. And a common acquaintance approached me and said, "Would you like to meet Roger?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love to." And so Roger sort of, he was 92, jumped down with a lot of vitality from the dais. And he introduces me. He says, "I know you." And I said, "You know me? How do you know me?" He said, "I read your newsletter." And it's true, he got the newsletter from the Bergen Society and used to read it. Then he asked me, he said, you know, who was the leader of the Ethical Society when I was a member? And I said, no, who was that? And he said, it was Dr. Felix Adler. And he said, do you know why he was a great leader of ethical culture? I said, no, I really, Mr. Baldwin, I don't know why he was a great leader. He said, well, because he had, Roger retorted by saying, well, because he had a lot of great ideas, a lot of new ideas. I, on the other hand, haven't had a new idea in the last 50 years, which I thought was, you know, pleasantly self-effacing, right? Okay, Roger Baldwin in the ACLU. John Elliott, who was Adler's successor as the senior leader here, was on the founding board of the ACLU back then, right after World War I. The Chicago group helped to found the Urban League. In 1946, as many of you know, we started the Encampment for Citizenship, which was really radical in its day. The encampment, which was started by a woman by the name of Nanny Politzer, who had been an advocate of suffrage, a member here of the New York Society. I met her too. She was 101 years old when I met her. She was a member of the society here, together with Algernon Black, who was also old, but not that old, who was the leader, famed leader here. Together with the help of Eleanor Roosevelt, started the encampment in '46. It was originally for college students from around the world and from different minority groups in the United States living together in diverse environments in encampments. So they were living together, cohabitating, and to have whites and blacks living together in 1946. And they would be involved, they were trained in what today we would call community activism. Okay, in terms of progressive change, which was part of Al's vision. Al was a democratic socialist and so forth. It was really radical for its day, so radical that we can be very proud that Joe McCarthy himself, okay, lambasted the Encampment for Citizenship as being a communist front organization. As they say, no enemies, no honor. So that was a point of pride. After the war, Eleanor Roosevelt helped us set up a commission to help refugees from the Second World War, and then in the 1960s and beyond, much of our activism and movement was taken on by our national organization, the American Ethical Union. We worked in the area of civil rights, women's rights. We were very active in trying to secure successfully a woman's right to a free and safe abortion. We were involved in anti-war work, anti-nuclear work, and one thing that I think we can be proud of, very proud of, a former leader of the society, Ed Erickson, and the former director of the AAU, he was the director at the time, Howard Radist, actually were personally instrumental in broadening, this was during the Vietnam War, broadening access to conscientious objection to non-believing objectors. That is, those people who were humanist, atheist, and so on. Traditionally, you could only be a CO, win CO status, if you belong to a particular peace church, like the Quakers, Amish, Mennonites. But through the work of Howard Radist and Ed Erickson, who became leader here, we were actually able to abolish those limitations, and anyone who claimed a strong, coherent, philosophical anti-war position, conscientious position, could win conscientious objection. And they did it, very interestingly, through a series of meetings that they were able to leverage with General Hershey. Do you remember General Hershey? No, he was the head of the Selective Service. Every young man feared General Hershey, right? He was the one who was going to draft you and send you. Like he and J. Edgar Hoover were these two old duffers who probably lived far too long, you know, and so forth, and really the bane of people involved in both civil liberties and anti-war work. And they were actually able to leverage meetings with Hershey, and they found him particularly open-minded. They were actually surprisingly able to expand his own personal perspective, and he came down with a directive and basically broadened the access to conscientious objection to humanists and folks like us and so on, and that was done explicitly by two of our leaders in the movement. So that was another contribution, again, fundamentally unknown, but significant. It was certainly significant to friends of mine. I was not a conscientious objector, but I had many friends who was. Okay, well, this list is fairly well known to many of our veteran members. For those who are unfamiliar with the period, it may seem that the ethical movement was unique in its commitments and achievements, especially in its first 50 years, what we might refer to as our golden age of social activism. But my purpose this morning, the purpose of my address, is to try to broaden and deepen our understanding of ethical culture's work in this period. I want to do this by situating ethical culture within the context of the broader movement of which we were one of many contributors. The truth is that ethical culture was not unique or alone in its social reform work. It was one expression among many of what historians refer to as the progressive era. The progressive era, which lasted from approximately 1890 to the end of World War I, or about 1920, that 30-year period. It was an extraordinarily vibrant period of political and social activism, which in many ways gave a rebirth to America in the decades following the unprecedented devastation wrought by the Civil War. My purpose in briefly talking about this wider progressive era, as noted, is twofold. First, as mentioned, I want to show how ethical culture was a creature of its times and the larger political currents that shaped it, and who our allies were back then. Knowing our history, I think, can deepen our identities as ethical culturists. But most importantly, my purposes are not merely historical. Rather, our history provides a very powerful and I believe inspiring lesson as we confront the critical political problems of our current political moment. We are at a time when the divisions between the extremely wealthy and the middle and working classes have widened to the point that I believe our democracy is truly in jeopardy. We are at a moment when our economy and our governments are controlled not by the many, but by the few who hold enormous power. We are also at a time when those who are marginalized and who are left out of the new economy are in a state of acute despair and are very frustrated and angry. It's this desperation and anger and despair which has opened up an opportunity for Donald Trump. The two major parties have abandoned these people. Democrats are guilty as well as Republicans. An anguished cry of that social distress is that older Caucasians who have lost hope have become addicted to opioids. I don't know if this has been in the press, have become addicted to opioids in staggering numbers and are committing suicides to such an extent that for the first time in American history, the average lifespan in the United States has actually declined. This and many other critical social dislocations are indices that our society, I think, is in a state of critical malaise. And that malaise has opened space again, as we well known, to demagoguery and an authoritarian huckster, bigot, and conman who has won the appeal of the dispossessed with a deluge of hate-mongering and false promises. I don't have to tell you who that is. Okay, you know what I'm talking about. Right? Right? Yeah. Right. Do I have to tell? All right. Okay. Good. My point is that the inequities we confront and the threats to democracy we experience now are very similar to many of the oppressions that confronted American society in the last decades of the 19th century and the first of the 20th. In response, those injustices inspired a broad-based movement to wrest control of American society and its government away from the oligarchs and plutocrats who exploited the masses for their own power and profit, and restored in greater measure to the people at large. It is important to know this because in these dark times, it is, I believe, a source of hope that we as a society have, knowing that we have been there before. We have met very similar challenges in the past. Democracy was threatened, and those were the movers and shakers. Those who were the movers and shakers of the progressive era transformed America in a way that restored democratic governance, and as such, they saved our nation. In short, we have done it before, and history suggests, I believe, that we can do it again. What was the progressive era? As the rubric implies, it was not a coherent movement, but a vast series of initiatives that took place at the grassroots, state, and national levels. The expressions of the progressive era were extremely diverse, uncoordinated, and in instances even contradicted each other. But the major tendencies that gave unity to the period was a belief that special interests needed to be eliminated from government and politics, that government needed to be controlled by the many and not by the few, and that government must intervene to relieve social and economic distress. And social and economic distress there was. The period in question was, like our own, a period of meteoric and encompassing transformation. If we find ourselves awed by the mind-boggling changes brought by the internet, cell phones, DVDs, and other wizardries of our electronic age, then our ancestors of 140 years ago were no less awestruck by the introduction of electricity, steam turbines, internal combustion engines, skyscrapers, electrified streetcars, elevators, motion pictures, phonographs, telephones, and other marvels that appeared with lightning speed. It was a period of great technological transformation, as is our own. The new industrialism moved production from wind, water, and steam to internal combustion engines and electricity. And production was dramatically moved ahead with the introduction of steel. We don't think of this. The invention of steel was a major contributor to American industrial growth. The introduction of steel that allowed for the creation of mass-produced, high-precision machinery, high-rise construction, and modern communication and transportation. All these innovations allowed manufacturers to expand their factories to allow for mass production, introducing the mind-numbing work of the assembly line. Economically, and most importantly, industry became dominated by huge, highly capitalized corporate organizations that guaranteed their immortality and placed huge wealth and power in the hands of a very few. It was the age of the robber barons, the J.P. Morgans, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers. There was little room in this new economy for skilled artisans and craftsmen. It was the new economy of the day. Work was transformed in its demand for hordes of unskilled laborers to toil in the factories without government intervention to safeguard humane, safe working conditions or humane wages. Decision-making became increasingly centralized. The demand for cheap exploited labor caused American cities to swell. Starting in 1881, millions of impoverished immigrants arrived from Eastern and Southern Europe who occupied urban slums and overflowing tenements. African Americans migrated from the rural South to the cities in the North seeking work. This aggravated racial tensions, too often resulting in race riots. As soon as they were old enough to work, children toiled in dangerous factories at a time when education in this country was not yet compulsory, not yet mandatory. Poor women as well as men labored in sweatshops, often for 16 hours a day for barely subsistence wages. My own grandfather was one of them, and again without health and safety concerns in the workplace. It was a period of gaping disparities of wealth, of teeming masses of the impoverished, of overpopulated, unhygienic urban ghettos, of substandard education, and in the last decade of the 19th century, epidemics of drug addiction, crime, and prostitution. Government was on the side not of labor, but of the masters of the Gilded Age, and everywhere there was corruption in both business and government. The status quo was held in place by several commanding ideologies that were presented as laws of nature and which legitimated the interests of the rich and the powerful. Among the most potent and pernicious of these ideologies was, quote, social Darwinism, which asserted that the prime law of nature in the social world, as it is in the natural world, is the survival of the fittest. This meant that only the fittest prospered, and their prosperity was proof of their fittedness, okay? Inversely, those who were poor or who occupied the lower rungs of society, by the dictates of nature, were unfit, and so therefore deserved to be poor. By asserting social Darwinism as a law of nature, its proponents could militate against social schemes or government intervention to try to level the playing field. This pernicious doctrine was strengthened theologically by what was known as the gospel of wealth. Harkening back to John Calvin, its proponents declared that prosperity was a sign that the wealthy were predestined for salvation in the next world. The poverty of those less fortunate was an indicator that they were preternaturally damned. Other laws of nature included the inviolate right of private property and the doctrine of laissez-faire, something very powerful, of course, today. Any intervention in these laws would inevitably leave everyone worse off, so it was argued. So these were among the economic, social, political, and intellectual injustices and oppressions the reformers confronted in the wake of the Industrial Revolution in the late 19th century. Those challenges were met, as noted, by a cascade of demands, protests, programs, movements, and initiatives at all levels of society. The scope of the Progressive Era was wide. Among the domains of public life that the Progressive Era embraced were labor, trade unionism, women's rights, civil rights, conservation, reform of government corruption, health and medicine, religion, temperance, and the breakup of monopolies, or trust busting, as it was often referred to. Perhaps a good place to start is with those muckraking journalists, writers, photographers, and cartoonists who exposed the excesses of the exploitation that was meted out to the underclass by the captains of industry and their allies in government. Among them was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Nast, okay, a German-born political cartoonist whose attacks on New York corruption and lampooning Tammany Hall helped to end the career of Boss Tweed, who through fraud enriched himself while controlling New York City government. Jacob Riis, who is close to not a member, but close to the New York Society, exposed to the reading public the reality of grinding poverty in his books such as, quote, How the Other Half Lives and Children of the Poor. He railed against slums. As a precursor, and as a precursor to the Flint water crisis. He exposed the quality of New York City's drinking water at a time when sewage was being commingled with the water supply, okay? Riis was also a documentary photographer whom I believe was the inventor of flash photography, okay? And he was a contemporary of the great documentary photographer Louis Hine, H-I-N-E. Now, Hine's very important to us specifically because Felix Adler actually hired Louis Hine to go into factories in New York City and document the exploitation of labor, including child labor. And if you go to Ellis Island, by the way, there are beautiful exhibits of Louis Hine's photographs of immigrants toiling in factories. And that was really the documentary. It was used as documentary evidence to try to push for reform in the workplace and to try to move towards the abolition of child labor, which our society was in the forefront of. Frank Norris assailed the power of the railroad monopolies. The journalist Lincoln Steffens attacked municipal corruption. Ida Tarbell, one of the pioneers of investigative journalism, in her book, quote, A History of the Standard Oil Company, depicted John D. Rockefeller as miserly, money-grubbing, and ruthlessly effective at monopolizing the oil trade. Perhaps the most famous of the muckrakers was Upton Sinclair, remember from high school, who exposed the horrors of the meatpacking industry in his novel, The Jungle. The uproar resulting from his expose led in 1906 to the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, the first consumer protection law of the 20th century, which sparked the creation of the Food and Drug Administration. The centerpiece of the Progressive Era was the labor movement, which extended from trade unions interested in the immediate gains of increased wages, limits to the work week, health and safety strictures, and collective bargaining, all within the capitalist system, to socialists, communists, and Marxists who agitated for the overthrow of the capitalist system. Though the labor movement was too vast and too complex to discuss at length, it involved boycotts, work stoppages, and strikes that not infrequently led to violence. It agitated successfully for the abolition of child labor, a major civilizing achievement. Though today, few people give it much thought, the reforms and protections that went into the unionizing of labor involved struggles for which people literally gave their lives. Felix Adler was not the only reformer of his day who believed that the resolution of what was referred to as the labor problem, the empowering of working men and women, was the linchpin in overcoming many of society's major social and economic problems. In the 30s, the federal government created the National Labor Relations Board to oversee the fairness of union elections and provide protection to workers from reprisals lodged at them by employers. And in time, laws have been passed to protect occupational health and safety, and beyond that, laws prohibiting discrimination in hiring practices. All these initiatives were born out of the matrix of the Progressive Era. Let it be said, however, that the United States remains the only industrialized nation yet without federal family leave legislation, although Donald Trump will fix that for us, or a guaranteed vacation from the toils of labor, okay? In these troubled economic times, when people who work full-time but do not earn enough to survive on their income, and people are increasingly stripped of protection, it might be good to recall the sense of purpose that animated the labor movement of the progressive era. It is not an exaggeration to say that the union movement in this country was the cornerstone in creating America's large and vibrant middle class. It is therefore no accident with the advent of Ronald Reagan and his attack on organized labor, the middle class in this country is hemorrhaging badly. Public service unions are the last vibrant bulwarks of organized labor, but they too are under attack by reactionary forces. The decimation of organized labor is a catastrophe for all of us and the goal of sustaining a just society. If we're going to get beyond the catastrophic and immoral wealth gap we have in this country, then we need to put front and center the reorganization of working people in order to leverage a secure and decent job as the basis for a secure and fulfilling life. Though men usually get most of the credit, the driving force behind the progressive era was exercised through the commitment of women. Under the 19th century doctrine of, quote, separate spheres, defining the roles of men and women, women were consigned to be the moral guardians of the home. Many progressive women argued, however, that in order to secure a moral home, they needed to move out into society to ensure that society at large provided an environment to sustain a proper home. Women in large numbers through clubs and civic associations agitated in large numbers for clean water, trash collection, hot lunches at school, community playgrounds. The fact that we have playgrounds in all the public schools came out of these initiatives. Playgrounds, fire codes for office buildings, public libraries, and many more reforms and facilities that today we take for granted. Women agitated for an end to prostitution and what was referred to then as white slavery and today is known as sex trafficking. Women promoted, quote, compassionate marriages in which each partner would relate to the other as equals, and a major component of that equality was the promotion of birth control as a woman's right. In 1916, Margaret Sanger opened a birth control clinic in New York and was arrested for violating what was known as the Comstock laws. Sanger also created the forerunner of Planned Parenthood, and it is a tragic index, I think, of how far this, the greatest country in the world, has regressed, that Planned Parenthood a century later is under attack and defunded as if it were a subversive organization. It's important I mention this because all of you know at the end of this month we are giving a high-profile award to Planned Parenthood for its 100 years of progressive activism on behalf of women, okay? It came out of the progressive era of that period. But the centerpiece of the women's movement in the progressive era was, of course, the struggle for women's suffrage. In that time, several large grassroots movements agitated for a women's vote. The more militant was the National Women's Party under the leadership of Miss Alice Paul. Just this past April 12th, President Obama dedicated the home, which was the headquarters of the National Women's Party in Washington, D.C., as a national monument in honor of Alice Paul. Paul was also the original author of the Equal Rights Amendment, which we have, of course, failed to pass. Phyllis Schlafly is part responsible for that. You know, Phyllis Schlafly just died. Again, some people take a little too long, I think, to leave. But she helped to kill what Alice Paul actually initiated back in the progressive era. Okay. The culmination of the suffrage movement was, of course, the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, granting the women the right to vote on the federal level. The achievement of the voting franchise, I should say, this is important, we don't recognize this, was not merely an electoral victory. It wasn't really giving women just the right every 4 years to pull a lever in a voting booth. It was also part, I think, of the social emancipation of women, because the right to vote demonstrated that the place of women was not exclusively any longer in the home, as the doctrine of separate spheres had dictated, but women, in effect, had an appropriate place in the social and public world. Okay, that's what the right to vote actually indicated, not just an electoral franchise, but a social transformation of the role of women in society. It's interesting, I wish I had more time, there's so many little chestnuts here. I don't know if you know this, the first jurisdiction in the United States to grant women the right to vote, it was in the 1880s, I believe, was the territory of Wyoming. Very interesting. Now, you wouldn't think of Wyoming as being particularly progressive, but the reasoning is interesting. Now, of course, there weren't very many women or anybody in Wyoming back then, right? But the reasoning was that if you lived on the frontier, particularly a very harsh frontier, such as Wyoming, in order to survive, women could not merely be relegated to the home. They had to be out in the fields, mending fences, chopping wood, working side by side as equals, social equals, with their husbands. And the reasoning was that, indeed, if this is what women were doing, it made no sense, do you see, to simply deny them the right to vote, because their social role was the equivalent of that of men. And so Wyoming, the territory of Wyoming, actually granted women the right to vote in the 1880s, because of the social transformation. So conversely, the right to vote, and again, is not merely an electoral entitlement, but signals the transformation of the social role of women out of the home and the breakdown of the rigidity of the doctrine of social spheres. Am I being clear about that in terms of its significance? Okay. This is probably also a good time to mention that the Progressive era also promoted the passage of 3 other constitutional amendments. The 16th, which ushered in the federal income tax. The 17th, which allowed for the direct election of senators. Okay, did you know that? People did not elect senators, okay, until relatively recently. And the 18th, soon to be rescinded, which created prohibition. Now, temperance, which was promoted primarily by women, think of Carrie Nation as the most renowned, was seen in its time as a progressive cause. It was primarily a women's cause in that the reality then as now was that drunken husbands were more prone to domestic violence, and because too many men squandered their wages at the saloon, undermining support for their families. So temperance was actually a progressive move to try to tame civilized men, as it were, to become better, more responsible husbands, rather than piss away their wages after work, in the bar or in the saloon, which was a major social problem. Also a cause sustained primarily by women, getting closer to us, is the settlement house movement. The first settlement in the US, University Settlement, as noted, was founded by Stanton Coit, an associate of Felix Adler in New York City in 1886. But the most famous was Hull House in Chicago, founded by Jane Addams, who also had an association with ethical culture. According to a historical source, settlement workers often carried out sociological research in their surrounding communities and offered childcare services, English language classes, meeting spaces, and healthcare services for residents in their community. Eventually, settlement house workers often convinced municipal and state governments to assume responsibility for programs they had initiated. In addition, settlement house workers often moved from undertaking community services to lobbying local, state, and national governments to pass reform legislation such as minimum wage laws, workplace safety standards, and sanitation regulations. Okay. When it came to race relations, however, the portrait of the Progressive era takes on a very different and unfortunate cast. After Reconstruction, when the South was imposing legalized segregation, progressives who were so ardent in the cause of justice, for the most part, turned a blind eye when it came to matters of race. Progressives, there were, however, exceptions. The first major labor union in the US, the Knights of Labor, which was actually a Catholic union, included African Americans. Some of the militant left-wing unions, such as IWW, the Wobblies, were fervently integrationist. The AFL started with a non-discrimination policy, but soon thereafter excluded African Americans. Blacks were often brought by employers as strike breakers, and tensions between whites and blacks in the labor movement often ran very high. As in so many areas, African Americans were forced to fight their own battles in the service of justice, freedom, and equality. Booker T. Washington, the most prominent African American of the day, promoted black education and black vocational developments. Blacks formed their own labor unions. Black women created their own clubs whose activities paralleled those of their white counterparts. Black women also founded mutual benefit societies, settlement houses, and schools. Some black female workers, particularly laundresses in the South, made efforts to unionize, and undertook strikes. Black women in the North also worked to provide services for black women recently arrived from the South. The National League for the Protection of Colored Women, which later merged with other organizations to form the National Urban League and colored chapters of the YWCA, offered services for female migrants. The late 19th century was probably the period in American history when anti-black hatred was most virulent and deadly. Perhaps among the ugliest and most despicable aspects of American history is the history of lynching, which reached its high watermark in the late 19th century, with 1892 being the year with the most recorded lynchings. African Americans comprising the vast majority of its victims. It was the most pernicious mechanism for sustaining white supremacy. Among the foremost opponents of lynching was Ida Wells. Born into slavery, Wells became a journalist who tirelessly campaigned against the horrors of lynching. She garnered statistics, wrote pamphlets, gave lectures, and raised consciousness about this ugly underside of American experience. Wells also collaborated with the great African American intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, who made trying to get passed a federal anti-lynching law a mainstay of his very long career. One example, I'm bringing this to an end, folks, one example of interracial cooperation of the progressive era was the founding of the NAACP. The NAACP had its origins in a petition drive initiated by Oswald Garrison Villard, the grandson of the noted abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison and the founding editor of The Nation magazine. Villard was also a very dedicated member of the New York Society for Ethical Culture. On the 50th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, Villard put out a call for a conference to address the political and social disabilities of African Americans. 106 people signed on, including Ida Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois, as well as 6 leaders of the ethical culture movement. In the early years, the NAACP retained a white and black leadership working together. And last, and a very critical dimension of the progressive era took place on the federal level. Theodore Roosevelt was heralded by most of the American public as a progressive, despite his mixed history on race and his advocacy of American imperialism during the Spanish-American War. As president, he used his office as a bully pulpit to rail against, quote, the malefactors of great wealth, and to cultivate his image as an aggressive trust buster. Roosevelt advocated for a, quote, a square deal between employers and employees. In the service of that goal, he aggressively committed to breaking up monopolies, including J.P. Morgan's Railroad Trust, and pursued the dissolution of 44 mega corporations. Would that we would have such initiatives coming out of the White House today. Okay, so on. Well, this brief historical survey of the progressive era just skims the surface of what was a major surge of democratic initiatives that literally transformed the American economic and political landscapes. It, as mentioned, served as the wider context in which ethical culture flourished in its early decades. Many of the luminaries I have cited, while not necessarily being members of ethical culture, traveled in our circles, felt a kinship with our movement, and often collaborated with it. They were indeed our wider family. The contributions of that period were lasting. Many historians see the progressive era as laying the groundwork decades later for the New Deal, the social welfare state, and the government entitlements that it brought. The triumphs of the progressive era should inspire us with hope that in the face of the challenges we confront today. Back then, a way was found to overcome the great disparities of wealth that threaten democracy as they do at the current moment. Throughout most of American history, there has been an implicit contract between the American public and what we might call the political class. Working Americans would permit those in power to govern as long as the paths to economic opportunity and advancement were kept open. But when the road to upward mobility has been slammed shut and economic advancement has stalled, that contract is broken, and the result is that democracy no longer really works. I fear that we are in such a moment, and it is for that reason that we must find a way to get beyond this monumental gap, wealth gap, between the top 1% and everyone else. It is not only immoral, it is necessary, I believe, for the very salvation of democracy. But my point in illustrating this chapter in our history is to show that our social conditions are not static and they're not determined. There was a time when we confronted mammoth problems as we do today, and we overcame them, and we can be proud that ethical culture was a part of the solution. So I say, let us be vigilant, let us be engaged, let us be passionate, let us be confident that we have the right values, and let us be hopeful that we did it before and that we can do it again.